The Mandalorian begins as a story about distance, not destiny, a lone figure moving through an enormous galaxy that does not care who he is, and that initial indifference is precisely what gives the early seasons their scale, the sense that the world exists beyond the frame and will continue regardless of the hero's presence. At the start, the galaxy feels wide because it is uninterested. Din Djarin is not a pivot point in history. He is a professional navigating systems that already function, already exploit, already decay, and his smallness inside that machinery is what gives his choices weight. Over time, that indifference erodes, the galaxy begins to recognize him, then revolve around him, and eventually collapse inward until momentum depends not on the world reacting organically, but on familiar faces re-entering the frame to keep things moving. What once felt like a lone gunslinger story rooted in anonymity gradually becomes dependent on legacy gravity, returning characters, known symbols, and narrative reassurance, shrinking the universe by insisting that importance must be inherited rather than earned. This shift changes how the world feels, not visually, but structurally. The galaxy no longer seems vast and autonomous. It feels curated, selective, and increasingly aware of its own mythology. Early on, mystery functions as negative space, unanswered questions about Mandalorians, the Force, the Empire's remnants, and Grogu himself create tension by refusing to resolve, allowing the audience to imagine a larger, messier universe beyond what is shown. Later, that negative space is filled aggressively. Every ambiguity becomes an invitation to explain, contextualize, or cross-reference. And as explanation replaces implication, the world loses depth, even as it gains detail. When every question has an answer, the galaxy stops feeling lived in and starts feeling managed, like a database rather than an ecosystem. The stakes follow a similar contraction. Threats do not escalate through consequence or evolution. They recycle. Imperial remnants resurface in different uniforms. Criminal syndicates reshuffle leadership. And conflicts repeat with altered aesthetics rather than altered meaning. Danger becomes episodic rather than cumulative. Each arc resolves cleanly enough to preserve the status quo, and because the future is already written elsewhere, no threat is allowed to truly metastasize. Side quests once served as windows into the galaxy, detours that revealed cultures, economies, and moral compromises without demanding long-term resolution. They expanded the world by reminding us how little of it Din could ever fully understand. As the story progresses, these detours feel less like discovery and more like obligation, narrative checklists that gesture toward expansion without committing to consequence, reinforcing the sense that movement is occurring without direction. The universe grows outward visually. New planets, new factions, new designs, but emotionally, it contracts because none of these elements are allowed to matter beyond their immediate utility. Grogu's role exemplifies this shift most clearly. Initially, he is a destabilizing force, a mystery that creates risk, tension, and unpredictability. His presence complicates every choice Din makes and introduces stakes that cannot be solved through violence alone. Over time, Grogu transforms from catalyst to anchor. His survival becomes guaranteed, his role becomes comforting, and his presence functions as a narrative safety net that prevents decisions from going too far. Rather than forcing change, he stabilizes it, ensuring that no matter how dangerous the situation appears, the emotional center will remain intact. This safety alters the show's relationship with loss. Early victories feel costly because they come with trade-offs. Later successes feel frictionless, achieved without permanent sacrifice or disruption. Din succeeds repeatedly, but nothing around him truly changes. Factions remain intact. Power structures wobble but do not fall, and the galaxy absorbs each event without visible ripple. This absence of consequence flattens scale. Scale is not measured by budget or spectacle. It is measured by what breaks and stays broken, and the Mandalorian increasingly avoids anything that cannot be reset. Characters return when they should be gone, relationships pause instead of ending, and choices are walked back to preserve future flexibility. The timeline itself becomes a constraint. The story is boxed in by outcomes already known, preventing actions from altering history in ways that would feel meaningful, and this inevitability seeps into the narrative's energy. When the future is fixed, risk becomes cosmetic, and tension relies on momentary danger rather than lasting change. Lore begins to replace risk. References stand in for stakes. Recognition substitutes for surprise. And the pleasure of seeing something familiar crowds out the discomfort of confronting something new. World building becomes backward-looking, focused on connecting dots rather than creating friction, and the galaxy starts to feel like a closed loop instead of an open frontier. The result is a story that appears to expand while functionally circling, revisiting themes, threats, and emotional beats without allowing them to evolve into something unrecognizable. Movement continues, but progress stalls, and the show's emotional range narrows as it prioritizes continuity over consequence. What once felt like a narrative moving forward through an indifferent universe now feels like a universe bending gently to accommodate a narrative that must remain intact. The implications deepen because a story that cannot allow consequence eventually loses scale, regardless of how many planets it visits. And the question becomes not where the Mandalorian can go next, but whether it is still allowed to go anywhere at all. The circling becomes most apparent when momentum is mistaken for motion. Episodes continue to travel, shootouts happen, allies are gained, enemies defeated, yet the emotional position of the story barely shifts. And that stasis is what ultimately shrinks the world more than any cameo ever could. Early The Mandalorian understood that scale comes from friction between the protagonist and the world. Din was constantly outmatched by systems larger than him, guilds, remnants, cultures, and economies he could not bend to his will, and every victory felt provisional, a temporary carve, out of safety in a galaxy that would not bend. As the series progresses, that relationship reverses. The world begins to accommodate Din rather than resist him. Obstacles appear, but they are calibrated to be overcome without lasting cost, and the galaxy becomes responsive instead of indifferent. This responsiveness is comforting, but it is also fatal to scale, because a world that adapts to the hero stops feeling autonomous, and autonomy is what makes a universe feel alive. The absence of permanent loss compounds this problem. Characters who should exit the story linger at the edges. Relationships that should fracture are paused, and emotional consequences are deferred indefinitely, creating the sense that nothing is ever truly at risk beyond the episode runtime. Loss is not simply death, it is the removal of possibility, the closing of doors, the transformation of relationships into something unrecognizable, and the Mandalorian increasingly avoids all three. When Din chooses, those choices are reversible. Allegiances shift without lasting resentment. Departures are temporary, and even ideological commitments soften when they threaten long-term comfort. This reversibility teaches the audience how to watch the show. Invest emotionally, but do not expect permanence. Feel tension, but do not fear transformation. Once that expectation sets in, scale collapses inward, because the audience subconsciously understands that the universe will return to equilibrium no matter what happens. The timeline reinforces this containment, existing between trilogies that already define the galaxy's fate. The story is prohibited from altering major outcomes, and rather than pushing against that limitation creatively, it increasingly settles into it. Events become decorative rather than disruptive, adding texture to known history without meaningfully complicating it. And texture without consequence is detail, not scale. This is where lore begins to crowd out story. References function as reassurance that everything is connected, but connection without risk becomes enclosure, a web that traps the narrative rather than expands it. Instead of using lore as pressure, the show uses it as scaffolding, something to lean on rather than something to challenge, and that choice subtly shifts the emphasis from what happens next to what the audience already knows. Grogu's narrative role reinforces this safety. His survival is assumed, his power moderated, his danger deferred, and his presence signals that the story will not cross certain emotional thresholds. He becomes a guarantee, not a question, and guarantees drain tension because they narrow the range of possible outcomes. In the beginning, Grogu destabilized the premise, forcing Din to choose between profession and attachment, safety and morality, and those choices redefined him. Later, Grogu stabilizes the premise, anchoring Din to a fixed emotional center that the story refuses to threaten meaningfully, and without threat, growth slows. The result is a protagonist who moves through space without moving internally, competent, likable, and increasingly insulated from the consequences that once defined his appeal. Scale is often misunderstood as spectacle, but spectacle without consequence is weightless. Explosions impress, but they do not linger. What lingers is what cannot be undone. The Mandalorian increasingly opts for spectacle that resolves cleanly, victories that close arcs without opening new wounds, and antagonists who disappear without leaving scars. Contrast this with stories where scale emerges naturally, not from size, but from aftermath, where success creates new problems, where survival demands compromise, and where every resolution narrows future options. In those stories, the world feels vast because it resists closure, because it refuses to be solved, and because it continues to exert pressure even when the hero succeeds. The Mandalorian's world, by contrast, increasingly feels curated. Challenges appear when needed and recede when resolved, leaving the underlying structure untouched. This is why the story feels like it is expanding outward visually, while shrinking inward emotionally. New locations do not introduce new rules, new factions do not introduce new moral costs, and new threats do not introduce new consequences. Everything is additive, but nothing is transformative, and transformation is the engine of scale. The irony is that the show still has all the tools it needs to reclaim that scale, but doing so would require risk, not in budget or action, but in permanence. It would require letting victories damage the world, letting losses reshape characters, letting choices foreclose futures, and accepting that not everything must be preserved for later use. It would require allowing the timeline to feel constrained rather than protected, using inevitability as tension rather than excuse, and pushing characters toward outcomes that feel smaller but truer. Most importantly, it would require letting the story move forward rather than around, choosing a direction that cannot be walked back without cost. The Mandalorian does not fail because it became popular, or because it embraced legacy, or because it expanded its scope. It falters because it became cautious about consequence. Caution flattens scale because it prioritizes maintenance over momentum, preservation over progression, and familiarity over fracture. A galaxy feels large when it does not care if the hero is ready, when it punishes hesitation, and when it refuses to return to equilibrium just because the episode ends. Right now, the story keeps moving, but it does not keep changing, and without change, even the largest universe begins to feel small.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.